If we tell a story of the American Revolution that only focuses on the person who's in charge of the Continental Army, or that only focuses on the people who were in the Continental Congress, you are missing out on the stories of all sorts of regular people who were instrumental in helping this country define what it means to be revolutionary and to define what the ideal is of the American Revolution.
Hi, I'm Danielle DeLeo Kim, Executive Director of Philadelphia 250. In 2026, the country will commemorate the 250th anniversary of American independence. So I invite you to listen in and get inspired to take action as Philadelphia 250 brings together thought leaders and changemakers to share what those founding promises mean to them now and in the pursuit to 2026.
Hi, everybody. I'm Janelle Burrell, anchor at CBS 3 Eyewitness News, and we are here to speak with Adrienne, Whaley, and Hannah Wallace about African-American history and its impact on race relations in Philadelphia. We're going to be talking to them about how their stories relate and the idea of people's histories as part of Philadelphia 250's In the Pursuit series. Firstly, I want to say I'm just so excited to speak with you both. I think a lot of people are going to get so much from this conversation. Let's start off with you, Hannah. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yes, so I'm the Educational Programming Manager for the African American Museum in Philadelphia. My work surrounds education in all its different facets, working with our volunteer docents.
I am Adrienne Whaley. I'm the Director of Education and Community Engagement at the Museum of the American Revolution. I am in charge of overseeing an amazing team of educators who are working on family program, gallery interpretation, K-12 education, and the whole gamut of programs that are really meant to enliven our story for all different audiences in Philadelphia and across the nation.
And you both work at these amazing institutions here in Philadelphia. Adrienne, for people who aren't familiar, tell us a little bit about the Museum of the American Revolution.
We are a relatively new institution. We just opened to the public in April of 2017. So you could say that we're still kind of a baby on the museum scene. What we're really trying to do is to uncover and share compelling stories about the diverse people and complex events that sparked America's ongoing experiment in liberty, equality, and self-government. What I love about that is that we're really emphasizing the fact that this is an experiment. And I feel like maybe it's never been more important than now to keep in mind that this is something that we're still in the process of trying to fix and figure out. And so what we're trying to do is to get people engaged in a conversation about the American Revolution, not just being a war, which is what people tend to think of it as, but as a process that we might still be in that involved economic changes, social changes, political changes, all sorts of evolutions in not only what started as the 13 colonies, but also in the world, frankly. So that's the message that we're trying to get out, that this is something that is dynamic and fascinating with many stories to tell, many things to dig into, and that it's a process that is still very much unfolding.
All right. And Hannah, for you, tell us a little bit about the African American Museum.
So the African American Museum in Philadelphia was founded in 1976 as a part of the nation's bicentennial. Our mission is to bring diverse communities together in greater appreciation of the Black experience. And we are the first municipally founded African American museum. We have 4 galleries, 2 of which are dedicated to our permanent exhibition, Audacious Freedom, which looks at African Americans from 1776 until 1876. And our upper galleries are all looking at African American art and culture.
Wow. I find what you both do so fascinating. I'm just curious, what got you into this type of work?
That is a great question, and I will answer it in 2 pieces. The first piece of this is that I actually majored in undergrad in African and African American studies. And it's very difficult to go through 4 years of that education without coming out of it feeling upset, I would say, and frustrated and wanting to have some way to be able to make a change in society. So coming out of that, definitely a piece of what I felt was what can I do to be able to make a difference? How can I help more people to learn this history so that we can try to not repeat it? How can I help people to appreciate this history so that we can do better in the future? How can I help to make a positive change in this nation? The other piece of how I ended up in museum education is that I just love history. And I already knew that I loved education. Well, what better opportunity to try to pursue than getting to work in a museum where I get to teach people about objects, about history, about art, about documents. And so I essentially just followed both of those pathways and tried to find opportunities in museums that would allow me to do both the wonderful, fun, engaging work of being an educator around objects, but also use those objects to share stories that are going to help people want to be more involved with their worlds, to be more understanding of their neighbors and communities that aren't like them, and to try to help people be better engaged, I think, and more appreciative and aware of others in the world around them.
Wow. So really melding your two passions together in your career. That's fantastic. How about you, Hannah? How did you get into this world?
So I have a similar story to Adrienne's. I came out of African American Studies at Temple University, and while I was working there, I had the opportunity to join on with the Charles L. Blockson Afro American Collection. I had a previous experience in libraries. That's really my first job was in a library. So it afforded me the opportunity to get to the Blockson. And while I was there, I just felt the warmth of historians and the warmth of the public when it comes to understanding ourselves and celebrating ourselves in a Black space. That was my first time ever, experiencing something like that. And to join into museums for a career kind of happened as an aha moment. One day I had to put away the a graduation gown for Dizzy Gillespie, which is a very specific moment, but something that just handling that sort of history and that very small moment that you usually wouldn't think of when you think of Dizzy Gillespie. You're not thinking of a graduation gown, but it just makes a full life experience out of the objects that we hold. So seeing that and feeling that just kind of put me in the direction of museums and wanting to think of tangible histories in a new light.
And I saw, Hannah, that over at the African American Museum, you have the Through His Eyes youth activism in the civil rights area in Philadelphia. Tell us a little bit about that. It's sort of a virtual experience, right?
Yes. So Through His Eyes is our first virtual exhibition. It's looking from the photographs of Jack T. Franklin, who was a prolific Philadelphia photographer from World War II and from the Civil Rights era. So taking his photography, which is looking specifically at Philadelphia, and looking at the youth and the role that the youth played throughout the Civil Rights movement. And it's so timely, of course, now that we're thinking of Black Lives Matter, now that we are experiencing Black Lives Matter, moving forward, Black Lives Matter, seeing what the youth, where the youth should be involved, how they should be involved, in ways that, that we're pushing these boundaries from the civil rights era into the 21st century.
And Adrienne, you guys have the When Women Lost the Vote exhibit. Can you give us a little bit about information about that?
When Women Lost the Vote is a really interesting exhibit that's examining a moment in New Jersey's history from 1776 to 1807, when both women and people of African descent, particularly people of African descent who were free, had the ability to vote. And that is about a 31-year frame of time where you're seeing this opportunity to live out some of the key ideals of the revolutionary moment. Now, it is a moment that does not last. And so, what this exhibit is doing is it's examining how we get to that moment. It's examining what happens during that period of fascinating constitution making, especially around 1776. I think it's a really important opportunity to think about whether we truly in this country view voting as a right or as a privilege, and who are the people who get to make that determination. And so that's what we're exploring through the exhibit, as well as through an entire bunch of surrounding programs and resources for adults of all different backgrounds, as well as children, families, and school students.
And it is so, so timely as you touched on there. How do you make, more generally speaking, how do you make sure that visitors really get a sense of the importance that minorities and women played in the American Revolution.
So, what people always hear me say, I probably say this at the start of every tour that I lead, is that there are approximately 2.5 million people living in this area that is going to become the early United States of America. Not all of those people were surnamed Washington or Adams, right? And so, if we tell a story of the American Revolution that only focuses on the person who's in charge of the Continental Army, or that only focuses on the people who were in the Continental Congress, you are missing out on the stories of all sorts of regular people who were instrumental in helping this country define what it means to be revolutionary and to define what the ideal is of the American Revolution. Right. 1 out of every 5 people in the revolutionary era, those 2.5 million people, 1 out of every 5 of them was a person of African descent, and tens of thousands of them were Native Americans. Right. You've got women, you've got children, you've got farmers, you've got merchants, you've got artisans, you've got sailors, you've got soldiers. Right. You have a whole entire array of people with all different life experiences. And so, what we believe is that to tell an accurate story, you have to tell a diverse story. And that's not about being politically correct. It's about actually reflecting what the world looked like in that complex moment in time. And we hope that by doing that, folks are engaging their historical empathy for those folks in the past, but also hopefully flexing a muscle that's going to be useful for them in the present day.
You know, these past several months have been just unprecedented for so many reasons in this country. You know, we have the pandemic, and also, of course, the summer of unrest. We had protests following, the death of George Floyd. The Black Lives Matter movement has become even more prominent in our conversations here in this country. How do you see what's going on right now eventually becoming part of the conversation and perhaps, an exhibit in your museum itself?
I'd say that if we could continue on the timeline of our Audacious Freedom exhibition, which goes from 1776 to 1876, if we could take it to the modern day, it would absolutely be Black Lives Matter. And we are actually going to be updating this core exhibition. That's part of our 2026 goals. So to take it beyond the timeline. So Black Lives Matter will have a place in our museum. I always tell folks, if you've created signs for Black Lives Matter protest, if you have, something that you have contributed to this movement, hold on to it because it is exactly going to find its way to a museum in the future. So I can definitely see it becoming a part of our core experience at the museum.
Yeah, I find that really fascinating that, some of the artifacts that are being used right now eventually, hopefully, decades and generations from now, people will be looking at back and learning about what we're experiencing right now in present day. Adrienne, how about you? Do you see what's going on right now eventually becoming part of your museum as well?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I feel like one of the things that we witness on the floor every day when our visitor engagement associates are chatting with our guests, they're having conversations about everything that's happening in the world. And we had no idea when we opened this museum in 2017 that so much of what we had on display was going to be so viscerally relevant in the world today. I mean, the very first thing that you experience when you come into our galleries is we've got a video of a group of people who've just heard the reading of the Declaration of Independence out loud for the first time in New York City. They gather around a statue of King George III right at the tip of Manhattan, and they throw ropes around it and they yank it down. Now, who knew in 2017 that a conversation about removing statues and icons and idols of the past was going to be so very relevant? Right. And so I think that sometimes people don't expect that a museum about the American Revolution is going to engage in difficult conversations, whether it's about politics or about race or about social justice or whatever it is. But again, like, it's a museum about revolution. And so, everything that we're exploring, it's not just about like white men in powdered wigs and like breeches, riding horses and signing documents with quill pens. Like, sure, those things are a piece of the story, but if we can recognize those individuals as just as human as we are today, then the story becomes one of real people who decide that based on a set of convictions, they're going to try to change the world. And so then if we try to imagine what that means for us, how can we as regular people use our convictions to change the world? The story of the American Revolution that we believe in is one where the American Revolution is about an expanding idea of who can be a part of this world, an expanding idea of for whom liberty, equality, and justice, right, or life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is an expanding idea of who those words can apply to. And that idea goes far beyond what the founders themselves imagined. So there, I think, is never a moment in contemporary history where you can't also be talking about the world around 1776. It all connects.
Philadelphia 250, of course, is looking forward ahead to America's 250th anniversary of its independence. That being said, Hannah, let's start with you. What are your hopes for Philadelphia and for the country as we look ahead to 2026?
Right. So looking forward to 2026, I think my first and foremost feeling is wanting the country and the world to have healed from the coronavirus pandemic. Who knows where we will be in 2026 with it, but there is a lot that needs to be done in order to make this world right again. Um, Looking at the museum specifically, in 2026, we will be 50 years old. We want to reflect back on how it is that the museum got here from our bicentennial celebration, understanding how we need to expand our core exhibition, Audacious Freedom. Of course, we're going to expand it beyond 1776 and 1876, but we also want to think about the new ways that folks can learn. Now that we're in the virtual realm, there's so many new tools that we can engage with. And also having more hands-on experiences, if that'll be possible in the future as well. But just taking time to understand, what it is that we can offer the public, what the public wants more from us, and expanding what the overall idea of the Black experience is throughout time and space.
And Adrienne, how about you? What are your hopes for Philadelphia and for the country? And what are ways that we can potentially contribute to get to that vision for 2026?
I think that there's so much work that we can all be engaged in. I think that my vision and the museum's vision as a whole is number one, that people will be more empathetic. We talk a lot about historical empathy in this organization and how important it is to help people to try to understand what the world looks like through somebody else's eyes and walking in their shoes. And what we hope is that by encouraging people and creating opportunities for them to practice historical empathy, that they will also be thinking about how they can use those same skills in the present day. I think that we can all agree that if people did a little more empathizing about the experiences of people who are different from them across all sorts of different life experiences, then we'd be living in a better world. I think that what we're also hoping that we see in 2026, and hopefully we see it before 2026, is that people spend more time not just thinking about their own individual rights, but also thinking about their responsibilities to others. I think that oftentimes what we forget is that in order for us to have a functioning society, those two things have to go hand in hand, right? It can't just be about me and what I deserve because of what the Constitution says or what the law has decided. It's also about what I do with those rights that I have and how I am willing to negotiate what I believe is mine versus what is also due to other people. I think that those are all things that we think would make 2026 look like the kind of world that we want to live in.
Well, ladies, you have just provided such a wealth of information and a lot to aspire towards. So, Hannah Wallace and Adrienne Whaley, thank you so much for your time. And I'm sure so many people are going to benefit from what you had to share today in this conversation. And on behalf of Philadelphia 250, I'm Janelle Burrell. Thanks so much for joining us.
We are all doing creative things all the time. We just may not call them that, right? We may not name it. And that tends to get people sort of willing to move forward in that way. Or just be really honest and say, I know I'm asking you to take a risk. Let's take it. I'll take it with you.